spend a lot of time thinking about why we protect objects and places. I want to know why we choose to protect some things over others, how we determine value, and who is making these decisions. For example, why are some places designated a state park and not a national park? What criteria are we using to decide? Who are these experts that determine what place is worth designating and which places are not? My name is Courtney Hotchkiss, and I'm a doctoral student at NC State University. The questions I pose to you are the basis of my research work, which looks at how public land managers need to start planning for which important places to focus on protecting, especially as climate change impacts worsen. My team is looking particularly at archaeological sites, which can be highly sensitive and vulnerable to climate change impacts and stressors. But these sites and places are not just archaeological sites, they are the ancestral homelands of tribal nations who value and understand these sites differently. Therefore, public land agencies need to work with citizens and staff of tribal nations to decide what and how to protect important places before they disappear forever. Let's start with some history. Public lands are often considered America's treasures, with some landforms referred to as America's cathedrals, comparing them to impressive, ornate European churches. Cultural and natural sites are often considered to be very valuable or important based on their beauty, history, design, or an event that took place, incorporating both intrinsic and assigned values. The most important sites are put on the National Register of Historic Places to be recognized for their cultural value and to receive additional protection. But the concept of national parks and other landscapes protected for their cultural and natural significance is a very Western concept. By Western, I mean white, educated, often wealthy men deciding that certain landscapes need to be protected for all to enjoy, and enjoyed in the way they perceive as best. Stephen Mather, director of the National Park Service from 1917 to 1929, believed that national parks are themselves American, and that American identity is tied to these protected places.
The parks do not belong to one state or to one section. They are national properties in which every citizen has a vested interest. Who will gainsay that the parks contain the highest potentialities of national pride, national contentment, and national health? A visit inspires love of country, begets contentment, engenders pride of possession, contains the antidote for national restlessness. He is a better citizen with a keener appreciation of the privilege of living here who has toured the national parks.
So what does this have to do with archaeology? Resource managers are responsible for taking care of the archaeological and other cultural sites within the boundaries of a park. And climate change impacts mean that sites will be damaged, exposed, or worse, destroyed forever. Once we lose the material or context of a cultural site, its value diminishes or disappears. Sierra Mandelko, an archaeologist at Glacier National Park in Montana, tells us about some of the impacts she's seeing.
Here at Glacier, we have kind of an unusual situation where we have a fire regime, fire intensity and frequency, wind events, high winds, and of course water. There's a lot of different kinds of water in Glacier, whether it's snow, glaciers, rain, and then runoff. And all these factors can feed into how climate affects sites in a bigger picture.
However, even though archaeology sites inform us about the past, many sites and landscapes are still actively used and honored today. Indigenous peoples are still here and still have connections to places, despite being forced out of their ancestral homelands, some of which are now national parks and other public lands.
So I recently had an opportunity to work with North Carolina State University on a wonderful project that was looking at including the indigenous perspectives more in how we speak about climate change. And one of an expert that I met many years ago, Michael Glow Jr., is working at the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and he is a fantastic resource. And I was so excited to hear that this project was going to work with him and to bring that conversation to the park. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes actually have a climate adaptation plan, and it was really one of the first plans that came out with some of that guidance, and it's a fantastic opportunity. Glacier in and of itself doesn't have a climate adaptation plan yet. We know that there's pieces of it in the works. And this really was our first opportunity to have that conversation and to start developing components of a plan for archaeological resources. And it was so important because this conversation really was the first time that we've been able to engage elders in how we approach cultural resource management on a climate change platform.
Mike Derglow Jr. is a member of the Salish, whose ancestral homelands are part of what is now Glacier National Park. He has been working hard for over a decade to integrate traditional knowledge into climate adaptation planning. Not only is he creating guidance and bridging conversations between Western land managers and tribal nations, he is working to protect places that are extremely important to people and ecosystems, humans and non-humans.
Part of my role in the Park Service is to carry out tribal consultation and conversations with tribes. And so I'm typically often asking their offices and tribal elders for guidance and recommendations on how we approach projects and construction projects, particularly in the park. But this is sort of more of a robust planning effort, looking at how do we manage archaeology sites before there's like a construction project that could affect them. This is really a proactive way to get in front of climate change events that we anticipate could happen. I think it can be challenging because Glacier already experiences fire and water, different types of water events and wind. And sometimes it's challenging to get in front of that conversation and say, what we anticipate climate change effects will have, because most of those types of things already happen. But what we anticipate that we're going to see is it's either going to become more hot and dry or more wet. And it really has everything to do with different microclimates that we have within the mountains.
I asked the basic question, why is it important to work with citizens and staff of tribal nations for climate change adaptation planning?
Yeah, it is absolutely critical. I think, especially with our tribal communities that neighbor us, they have access to elders and folks that have really studied and dug into climate change effects. They have this whole history of oral tradition, and some have shared that it goes back, hundreds of generations. And that's a great resource that we can tap into to help understand what is going on the landscape, and to help us, understand what our next steps are for preserving these resources. The thing about archaeology is it's often shown as something that you interact with an object, and oftentimes I try to share with people that you're trying to put people back into the background of how that object was made or used, and to make it a little bit more of a presence and relevant to people here today. And with climate change, we know that those artifacts are, destroyed through the fire effects or through erosion. They get moved and out of context. And so it's very difficult when someone brings an artifact, a piece of pottery or a piece of stone tool, and they say, tell me about this, if we don't know where it came from, where it was located on the landscape. And so climate change can really easily displace those locations of materials. And so it's really important to kind of get ahead of that, understand how the landscape is changing, and to involve those tribal communities in how we understand these sites and how to preserve them for the future.
There are over 500 federally recognized tribal nations in the U.S., and they do not have one unified voice. That makes sense. They have different histories, languages, cultures, and were relatively recently forced from their homelands. Broken treaties, wars, and cultural genocide from the U.S. government meant that some cultural groups were wiped out, or aspects of their culture, like language, have been lost. But that doesn't mean they have lost their connection to the places they live, were removed from, or now call home, nor is the connection to the objects left by their ancestors broken.
The national parks belong to everyone, to the people, to all of us. The government keeps saying so, and maybe, in this one case at least, the government is telling the truth. Hard to believe, but possible.
Edward Abbey was an environmentalist with a controversial past, so he might not have been thinking specifically of marginalized groups when he says, all of us. But, like the laws and policies we use to guide the management of public lands, we can expand our approaches, perspectives, and our humbleness. Abbey is correct that national parks belong to everyone, and everyone, especially living descendants, need to work together to prepare for the known and unknown of a changing climate.